to Night Talk. Welcome to Night Talk, everybody. Tonight I'm going to talk to you about a past investigation we did back around, 2001, 2002, something like that. But this investigation, it was unbelievable, just unbelievable what we discovered, not only through Rod, our more or less psychic, and testimony by a neighbor that we spoke to. But first, let me tell you a little bit about Prague. Prague was plated and surveyed in the early years of 1887. The town is located in Section 36, Chester Precinct, and the town had its beginning with the completion of the Burlington Railroad in 1888. At the very beginning, the town did not grow very rapidly, but by the year 1896, the business section had taken a quite important appearance. At this time, there was one bank, one drugstore, one doctor, one hotel, one harness shop, one delivery bar, one machine shop, one blacksmith, one well boring outfit, one steam mill, one elevator, two furniture stores, two butcher shops, two hardware stores, two carpenter shops, two shoemakers, four saloons with one dance hall, and a general store, or four general stores, excuse me. Now let's get on with what I'm about ready to tell you. Our investigation started off on a very strange note. A woman contacted me for an investigation, and she was in the process of moving out and not in to her house. I thought it was a bit strange, but I told her I would meet with her in town at the local Kwik Shop located on Highway Avenue, just off Highway 77 in Prague. We sat down, had a soda, and as I listened to her and her husband about some of the occurrences they witnessed, first off, only a month had passed since they moved into this house, and now they were moving out. To me, that was, in itself, was strange enough. The very same day they moved in, she took a picture of her 6-year-old daughter on the front porch, in front of the front door. The woman said, "This was the first house we've ever lived in, and my daughter wanted a picture to show her grandma." So she reached into an envelope and she pulled out a picture of her daughter on the porch in front of the front door. Just on the other side of the storm door, inside the house, was an elderly man looking out at them. The man appeared to be a bit translucent, and his face was distorted. He was dressed in an old-style suit, and he had an old-style hat on, called a derby. She then told me about some of children. They could hear screaming and crying sometimes during the day, upstairs in the bedrooms. She found a little boy curled up in a corner of the fruit cellar underneath the house crying one afternoon. When she spoke to him, he vanished into thin air. And quite often, they would hear a woman screaming and or crying at night between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m., at least 2-3 times a week. She also told us about doors that would slam shut. They would hear heavy footsteps in the hallway upstairs during the day and sometimes at night. Dishes would fly off the table, and their 2-year-old dog died for no apparent reason, just days after they moved into the house. The vet looked at the dog and found absolutely nothing wrong with him. Her entire family slept in her room every night because they were afraid. She also mentioned she would find bruises on her children's arms and backs. Her husband said, "We are moving out and we are going to stay at my brother's house in Oakland, Nebraska until we find a new place. We just want you to check it out to see what you think." The stories they told me were out of this world, to say the least, but I heard stranger things before. We started our investigation the very next night, around 10 p.m. I'm pretty sure it was on a Friday night. The husband unlocked the door, but he and his wife refused to go in. They wouldn't even step inside the door. Instead, they went out into the driveway and waited by their cars. I'm going to show you some pictures of what we got during the investigation. And I'll tell you a little bit about them. This is the house. That's the door where the little girl was standing in front of when she had her picture taken. That's the living room. As soon as we walked into the house, we had this very uneasy feeling. I myself felt very uncomfortable. I felt threatened. And we started off just walking around taking some pictures. And we took some EVP recordings as well, but we didn't get very many of those. This is one of the upstairs bedrooms. The guy you see standing in the doorway, that's Rod. He claimed to be a psychic. Me, I don't believe in psychics. I mean, if you tell me you're a psychic, you're going to have to tell me something that I already know for fact. You know what I'm saying? Sure, there's some, but, you know, I ran across people that claimed to be psychics and had no idea what they were talking about. But Rod, he was a bit strange. He told us that the house was full of evil, full of bad spirits. But he also said that there were some children there, and some of the children felt very unhappy and very, very sad. He walked into the room and he stood there, and these orbs, they more or less just followed him into the room. He's standing there and he's telling us about these children that are gathering around him and they want help. And, you know, I'm standing there taking pictures. I'm thinking, yeah, okay, for sure. This is, we had to darken the edges of this picture because the wallpaper was very distinctive, and we didn't want any way for anybody to recognize this house whatsoever. But these people, they were debating whether or not they wanted to take their furniture out of the house or not. That's how bad they were scared. This is outside. You see a lot of orbs here, but some of the stuff that you see, some of the real smaller stuff, lighter stuff, that's dust. Okay, I don't want you guys to think that I'm claiming, look, if there's 1,000 orbs here. Rod, we went into this barn here. Before we went in, I took this picture. And look at the orb up there in the top right-hand corner, over the top of that doorway or that opening, whatever you want to call it. We went in to the barn, and as soon as we got in there, Rod stopped, and he started telling me that a woman committed suicide in here. She hung herself from the rafters there, and she was very sad. She wasn't very old. He said she was in her early 30s. This is upstairs in the barn. You got an orb up there. When I got up there in the attic, I didn't feel scared at all. Matter of fact, I felt like I was welcomed up there. This is a tool shed. There's a few orbs back there in the background. Now, let me go on to tell you about some of the things that Rod told us. Rod told me that there was a woman in there that was very scared, very sad, that she was abused by her husband and beaten. And all of a sudden, he stopped and he said, he killed her. He murdered his wife. And I looked at him and said, what are you talking about? And he said, he did. He killed her. He beat her to death in the kitchen. And then he took her body outside and buried her by a tree. I'll show you the tree here in a little bit. But he took us outside and he showed us where this tree was. And he walked around and he said, the woman's telling me she's buried right here in this spot. And I'm thinking, yeah, okay, you know, like I told you, psychics, I don't believe in them much until they tell me something that I already know for fact. And then we went back in the house, and he started telling me about these little kids that were beaten all the time by their dad, and he would whip them with a belt. And we went back outside again, and he went to the fruit cellar. And we opened the door and went downstairs into the fruit cellar underneath the house. He said, there's a little boy down here, a 7-year-old boy. He was killed down here. He was beaten to death by his dad. And he died down here. Rod said he's over in the corner crying. And, you know, I'm feeling pretty bad. You know, I'm very protective of women and children, and I don't like to hear things like that. And we went back upstairs and went back in the house, and Rod proceeded to tell me that there were 5 kids here, and the youngest one died, but the other ones grew up in the house. He said none of them ever got married, and he stopped and he waited a minute. He said 2 women committed suicide, one with an overdose of drugs, and the other one hung herself in the barn. And it's because they were sexually abused by their brothers. And I thought, you are really coming up with some strange stuff here, buddy. Well, anyway, we went back outside. He said there's a spirit that wants us to follow him. So we went back outside. We went over to the corner of a yard. And Rod said, they're buried here. They're buried right here underneath this tree. But their stones have been thrown away. And I go, well, where were they thrown away to? And a couple minutes later Rod said, he wants us to follow him. And we started walking through this field. And I thought, where the hell are you going? And we went down to this ditch. And Rod took us directly to where the headstones were. And we found them. And, you know, there were quite a few of us, you know, in the group. So we all grabbed as much as we could find. And we took them back up and we placed them underneath the tree. We didn't know where they went, but we placed them back under the tree to where they were supposed to go. And we left there. What else did we do? Well, that's about as much as he told me. He told me that one of the brothers, well, he said that most of the children that grew up in the house became alcoholics like their dad and were very abusive to their sisters. sexually and physically. Now, I'm going to show you some pictures. Wrong ones. Oh, we got one EVP we got quite a few EVPs, but we had a house fire and we were only able to save this one. I'll play it for you. Now, did you hear that little boy? I don't know what he was meant by the girl missed me again, but at the end of it, I didn't notice until just, when I was making this feed up, that at the end of the little boy's voice, there's a man that starts saying something, but I don't have it, unfortunately. But let me show you the house. This is an aerial photograph. It was taken by my drone. I use a drone. Well, we didn't have the drone at the time of the investigation. I went out there recently and parked down the road from this house and flew my drone over the top of it. And I took a picture of it. Underneath that tree there is where the wife was buried. And she was murdered. Oh, Rod told us that the night that she was murdered, there was a very bad thunderstorm, a lot of rain, a lot of thunder, a lot of lightning. And he murdered his wife and took her out there and buried her in the ground in a shallow grave. Then he piled a bunch of stuff up on top of her. There's where the family graves were. That's where all the family members were buried, except one. And she died just a few years ago prior to our investigation. But that's where the grave markers were found. We found grave markers down there. We didn't find, all the pieces because they were broken up a little bit. There was only one, I think, that was a solid piece. And we took them back up to the trees and laid them by the trees. There's the barn. That's where one of the girls hung herself, inside the barn. And she was sexually abused and beaten by one of her brothers. And she just couldn't take it anymore. She couldn't get away. Now after our investigation that night, a few days after, we drove back out to the area to see if we can get some more information about the house and the people that live there. We asked several of the neighbors that lived in the area if they, would talk to us about the house and the people, and they refused to talk to us. Some of them were extremely rude, matter of fact. We finally found a woman by the name of Catherine Dyer that was willing to talk to us. She lived a little over 1.5 miles away from the house, and she said when she was young that she used to babysit for these people. She's about 80 years old. She said the house was built in 1937 when she was about 16 years old. She said she knew the people that lived there in the house, and she said she would babysit for them every Friday night when the couple would go to town to the dance. I then asked her what kind of, what were the people like? She said the lady, Rebecca, was the woman that was murdered, was a very nice lady and a great mother of 5 kids. 3 girls and 2 boys, but her husband was, and I quote, a real drunken asshole. Pardon my French, but that's what she said. I asked her what she meant by that, and she said Harold was a drunk and really abusive to Rebecca and the kids. He would go out almost every night and get drunk in town, and then go home and beat on his wife and kids. She recalled a few times when she came home from the dance in town that he would start beating on Rebecca as soon as they got inside the door. Catherine said, I remember going over there a few times with my mom, and Rebecca would have a split lip, bruises all over her arms, and one time she had a black eye. The kids would have welts on their backs from being whipped with a belt, and other bruises on their arms and their legs. Sometimes he would lock the kids in the fruit cellar for days as punishment for stupid things, according to her. She said that the children just hated their dad. Those 5 kids had no protection other than their mother. The Department of Health and Human Services wasn't founded until April 11th, 1953. And Child Protective Services, CPS, was first established in response to the 1974 Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, which mandated that all states establish procedures to investigate suspected incidences of child abuse. When I asked her what happened to the family, she told us that Rebecca finally got tired of the abuse and left him one night during a bad thunderstorm. I just about fell over when she said that, because Rod told me that she was murdered the night of a bad thunderstorm, a lot of thunder, lightning, and rain. And it just threw me off when I heard her say that. She said she was about 18 years old when Rebecca left, and she found it very strange that she would leave him on a night during a bad thunderstorm with nowhere to go and no way to get there, and not take her kids. What mother would leave and not take her children? Leslie asked her what happened to the family then. Catherine said the dad died one summer night in an accident, driving while he was drunk. She thinks he was between 50 and 55 at the time. The kids all stayed in the house. None of them ever got married, and they all died in the house. Some of them turned out to be drunks like their dad, again, like Rod told me. The youngest boy, Bobby, died at home when he was about 7 years old. Boom. Rod told me about a little boy crying down in a fruit cellar, and he was about 7 years old. 2 of them committed suicide when they were in their early 30s. One of the girls hung themselves in the barn. Another one overdosed by sleeping pills and killed herself. And another boy drank himself to death when he was about 40 years old. And the last one died a few years ago after a heart problem. The house was then sold at auction in 1998 to some guy from Lincoln, Nebraska, and he turned it into rental property. She said he must have been a lousy landlord because people keep moving in and out constantly. Nobody stays there for a very long period of time. I was blown away by that because a lot of that stuff Rod told us. Now, when I found out that the woman was murdered and buried out there in the yard, and Rod showed us exactly where she was buried, I contacted a couple law enforcement friends of mine, and I told them about it, and they said, well, what you can do, you can contact the sheriff's office of that county and tell them, your story about this woman. But the odds of them believing it, to get a search warrant to go out there and dig up this guy's property, is slim to none. We finally hunted down the guy that owned the property, and we tried talking to him, and he just came unglued. He did not want us to search for this woman's body, and he was angry because we replaced the headstones. Coming to find out, he took them down there and threw them in the ditch. so that he could rent the property, because he didn't want anybody to think that there were people buried on the property if they're renting the house, which is kind of anal. But that would explain all the occurrences. But this house, the evil that you felt in there was unbelievable. I mean, everything that went on was just horrific. But anyway, that's the story about the Prague house. And the house is still standing today, and it's still rental property. And as far as I can tell, people just don't stay there very long. Okay, our next feed will be on April 18th at 9 p.m. Central Time. And it'll be about common causes of hauntings. There are some causes that you would never think of, but there's a lot that people just know, just common sense. But there's a lot that you'll be surprised about, okay? So, I hope you guys join me again next Thursday night, 9 o'clock Central Time, to hear the feed about the common causes of hauntings. And if you guys have any suggestions of what you'd like to have a topic about, please let me know. If you like our feeds, please let me know. Okay? So, until next week, Thursday, 9 o'clock, I will talk at you guys later.
You're going to come back and see us, aren't you? You better be. We need you. We gotta have you. We depend on you. Come on back and see us. The feed has ended. Sleep well.